We are broadcasting. Hello, welcome everyone. As you come in, feel free to fill out the poll that you see in front of you. We want to know what experience you have with writing any LTEs or letters to the editor, any op-eds you may have written before. If you're familiar with ranked choice voting, we're very pleased to have a guest here with us today. First of all, my name is Mohit Nair. I'm the Partnerships Director for FairVote Washington. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit committed to making our democracy more fair, functional, and representative. And we're doing that by advancing ranked choice voting. We're blessed to have Ashley Houghton here with us today. She joins us from FairVote, which is the broader national organization, as the Director of Communications, and she leads the communications department. She's been a communications strategist for more than a decade, worked with hundreds of advocacy nonprofits to more effectively participate in the public conversation. She was the Amnesty International's domestic refugee and she worked on the domestic refugee and asylum campaign as the tactical campaigns manager. She's also spent 7 years at Rethink Media and has had a hand in crisis response during every major national security crisis over the last decade. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ashley.
Thank you so much, Mohit, and I'm just so thrilled to work with all of you. I know that we're still waiting on folks to trickle in, so maybe as we get started, if people can just share a little bit about themselves in the chat. So what I'd love to hear is who you are, where you're from, particularly if you're hailing from in or outside Washington, and any experience, maybe your favorite media experience in the last year. So whether it's you've had an interaction with media, or you just thought that media covered a story in a certain way that you thought was pretty interesting. I'd love to share those stories. Often in these trainings, I also go through everyone's least favorite media moment, but that seems a little bit more traumatizing during these times. So, favorite media moments and personal experiences. And I see that we're getting attendees.
Yeah, definitely. And folks, throughout the webinar, feel free to engage with us using the Q&A function in Zoom. You can ask questions at any time. You can also type your questions in the chat window. We'll be looking at it throughout the presentation, and we'll try to get to those as we go through the presentation. If we don't, we'll definitely circle back. But we'd love to hear from you and make this as interactive as possible. I also see a lot of engagement on the polls. Thank you to those of you who are filling out those questions. So far, Ashley, we're seeing about 67% of folks have never written a letter to the editor before.
Great, this is perfect. It means that we can ramp up skills very quickly. And letters to the editor are some of the most impactful ways that people can engage.
Absolutely, especially now in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, when all of us are at home, but we're reading the news on a daily basis. We are behind our computers. We can definitely engage and write as much as possible. So after this webinar, hopefully you'll be equipped with the skill sets to be able to write an effective letter to the editor and op-ed.
Fantastic.
And I see a lot of folks, about 19 on the call, are already familiar with ranked choice voting. That is wonderful to see. It's awesome.
Fantastic. Laura, so pleased to meet you. I feel as if all of us are kind of inundated with media interactions, whether or not they're consenting at this point. So I think a lot of us feel a little swamped by media right now. And sometimes it's hard to come up with a positive interaction. Valerie, Miami, right on. I did a lot of work in Miami in my last job, just south of you all in Homestead, Florida. Hope things are safe and well in Miami, and you run the Indivisible Twitter account. That's awesome. That's fantastic. Caroline, pleased to meet you. You've written letters to the editor of the PCC on getting rid of bottled water. Brilliant, yes. And I've found that that's a note that people are particularly focused on right now as people are hoarding bottled water. Michelle and Hugh, so pleased to meet you. Thank you so much for coming on. Greg from Louisiana. Greg, thanks so much for hopping on. And I'm really glad that you've been informing yourself on ranked choice voting. Let's see, can I increase my image on your computer? I am a small image on a FairVote field. Oh, yes, but we're gonna be moving to a PowerPoint presentation soon enough. So you're gonna see way more interesting stuff than this whole face. Brilliant. Well, should we get started? It sounds like
Yeah.
we've got a pretty good quorum of folks. So thanks again to Mohit for introducing me. I'm the communications director at FairVote, and my goal today is to empower you to feel confident in media. So today we're going to talk about winning the opinion page by writing op-eds and letters to the editor. Today we're going to go through the basics of messaging and why you're an expert, even though you might not feel like one. We're going to go over op-eds briefly because those tend to be a much more engaged process where if you're interested in drafting one, you can work with us on what that looks like. But then we're going to spend more time on letters to the editor, including stopping for questions and doing a practice letter to the editor together and look at our letters in real time. Letters are a particularly effective way of not just getting your own opinion out there into the media cycle, but also encouraging a newspaper to editorialize on that subject. So we're going to get into why that works later. So that's what today's structure is going to look like. So first of all, let's get started with a note on messaging. I am a propagandist by trade, and I will be the first to tell you that I have never in my entire career ever successfully won an argument. If I find someone on the street who disagrees with me fundamentally, I have never been able to find the right fact or the right figure to convince them that they're wrong. And this is something that you might experience if you sit around the Thanksgiving table, right? So you have the person who sits across from you, you start talking politics, they start talking politics, you realize that you're on the other side of a particular debate. And if you just try to win that battle by shouting down their beliefs or saying, you know, I'm right because of these 5 points and you're wrong because of these 5 points, you never actually change their mind. And you can see this on Facebook every day. You can see this on Twitter. The battle ends up becoming more of a sport than an effort to actually win someone over. So when we're talking about opinion pieces, our goal is never to come up with the right argument to convince someone to change their mind. Our goal is to figure out what they care about and to meet them there. This is a fundamental change in the way that a lot of us approach this work, right? So advocacy, I come to the table because I care about these things, and they come to the table because they care about something else. And so I need to share how much I care so that they'll care as much as I do. And that actually doesn't work in practice. What you need to figure out is what your audience is most likely to care about and figure out why your mission, your work, fits within their value system. So I'll take an example of this. One of my old jobs, I worked a lot with the Muslim, Arab, and South Asian community, and we worked in response to what is now known as the Muslim ban of 2017. And the people that I worked with, you know, I came to that issue because I cared a lot about bullying, and I cared a lot about religious freedom. And I thought that, you know, the people that I care about in my life should not be persecuted. But my uncle, who happens to be Mormon, agreed with me fundamentally on every step of the issue for completely different reasons. And it was because the anti-Muslim legislation of 2017 was actually rooted in the same anti-Mormon legislation of the 1800s. They'd literally lifted some of that language. So he might not come to this from the same perspective that I do, but he understands the impact of this work. And it doesn't matter what brings each of us to the table. We just care about it from the same way. So as we're starting to craft messages, let's think about the things that the other person cares about and think about the language that's going to be most impactful to them. It also doesn't have to be about argument. It can also be about authority. So when we talk about authority, this isn't just being an expert in a subject matter. It's about what makes people trust you. So, you know, if most people develop a perception of what someone is like within 30 seconds of meeting them. So the moment that you saw me on the screen, you probably had 500 different ideas about what I'm like or what I could be like. And in those 30 seconds, you probably developed a value judgment. Like, am I gonna listen to her? Does she seem credible? Does she seem relatable? Do we agree on the same things? Everyone does this all the time. It's not a bad thing, but it's something that you need to be aware of as you start to draft your own op-ed or letter to the editor. It's creating a moment where someone can relate to you, no matter who they are or what common backgrounds you have. So when you're drafting a letter to the editor, for example, talking about your experience as a parent, talking about your experience as a teacher, as a neighbor, right now, talking about your experience in a pandemic and being authentic with that also gives you a level of authority. It means that the person that you're talking to is going to find you relatable. And then I also put up here the op-ed project. Has anyone done any work with the op-ed project? Just chat in the doobly-doo, the chat if you have. Does anyone know about the op-ed project? Just gonna pause here. No? Okay. So the op-ed project, brilliant, this is great. The op-ed project is an organization that started because they noticed that women weren't being quoted on the opinion page of the newspaper. They noticed that women were being quoted maybe 13% of the time, particularly in the op-ed section. So they did a study and they looked into, like, is this inherent bias on the part of editors? Is it that issues that are traditionally seen as women's issues are not getting picked up in the op-ed section? And what they discovered is that women simply weren't pitching themselves. And women weren't pitching themselves because they didn't see it as their place necessarily to write an op-ed to a newspaper. They thought it was someone who had greater authority than them. So the op-ed project was born out of that. And they've been training women leaders on how to write letters to the editor and op-eds for the last decade. And it's a really cool program. And I share this because a lot of us come into this not certain of whether or not we have authority or even the right to talk about these issues. So let's talk about why you're an authority. If you know about ranked choice voting, you are a greater authority than someone who doesn't know about it. If you're someone who voted for a candidate who dropped out before the primary and you have a wasted vote, that is a perfect example of you being an expert in something, right? You are an expert in losing your vote and how ranked choice voting could have helped you keep that vote and saved your vote. If you have voted in every election since 1972, you're definitely an expert in voting. If this is your first election, you're an expert in voting, because what newspapers are looking for is someone who could be an authority on a specific subject. So I hope that makes sense. I'm also going to pause here. I would love to take a moment for people to share on the chat what they are actually an authority in. So when people come to you asking for advice, what do they tend to come to you for advice on? And it can be anything. We have quantum mechanics here. By all means, technology, yes. Nice. Oh, I love this. Discrimination with the LGBTQ plus community. What community services are available? Math, climate change. Math is great on this, right? We're securing elections with math. Elementary reading teacher. First of all, hope teaching is going well right now. Elections, being an attorney. Fantastic. So I see an enormous wealth of knowledge. And as we approach how we want to write our op-eds and our letters to the editor, consider leveraging that experience. So for example, if you are a teacher who's let's see, it was elementary school, right? I'm just scrolling up. The ability to listen, elementary school reading teacher. So you could draft a letter to the editor of, as I'm answering children's questions about the upcoming election, I keep hearing one question. Or, excuse me, if you are an attorney, you have spent more time reading about the Constitution than most of your neighbors, right? And what rights and responsibilities do we have as citizens? If you're working on LGBT plus issues, you know how important it is to get representation when it comes to elections, right? And so these are opportunities for you to bring in your own experience. So let's talk about the difference between an op-ed and a letter to the editor. Op-eds are essentially you writing as an authority, almost like presenting in front of a group based on your personal experience. So let's imagine that you're getting invited to speak at a conference. This is the Commonwealth Club in California. You would be the unique speaker that they invite to share your views with an audience. So this is reflected in the form of writing that you provide. It's usually 600 to 700 words. It's submitted about 2 days after news breaks. You know, you have a couple of days for people to provide analysis, and then you're providing your feedback. Like, and this is what I think. You always offer it as an exclusive to a newspaper because they want to provide a unique point of view based on who you are. So as you're approaching it, consider what audience you're trying to reach. So if you've been asked to speak to a specific audience, what does that audience look like? And this is actually how op-eds are written. So if you've been through 6th grade English, you should recognize most of this content. It's a little different. We're going to start up at the top. Do you see the hook up at the top? The hook in what we call the lead paragraph, the LEDE, the hook is what makes someone interested in what you have to say. It's not your thesis statement. So it's the first line of your op-ed, and it's what's supposed to capture someone's attention. I have an old colleague who said he never wrote a first sentence of an op-ed that was more than 10 words long. And it's what makes them curious about what you have to say. So for example, here, and this is where you can get into the circle with the person that you're trying to reach, right? This is where you can use your authority and what makes you relatable, make yourself trustworthy. It could be, my family can only agree on 2 things, football and politicians. We are pro-Seahawks and anti-politicians, right? So at the very beginning, you're getting into the door of what do you agree upon and what do you disagree upon? And from there you can say, you know, why is it that in a society where politicians rely so much on public opinion, their profession can be so hated? Well, it's because they only have to campaign for their base, or it's because we have this structural system that doesn't allow people's voices to be heard. And that's when you start to get into what your introductory paragraph looks like. At the very bottom of your introductory paragraph, you write your thesis statement. This is your argument summed up in a sentence or 2. And then you have your 3 supporting paragraphs. Now, when we talk about evidence, it doesn't actually have to be data. What we've learned is that data is actually less effective than personal stories. So if you have a personal story of what it was like to vote for someone and know that your vote didn't matter at the end, if you have a personal story of, or even a quote, so if you can quote someone who is deeply appreciated, or someone who appeals to a broad audience, that's useful. Or if you have a political argument that's everyone can agree that. Those are all pieces of evidence. So evidence doesn't have to be, we have an attorney here, evidence doesn't have to be carefully considered. It can be anecdotal, it can be personal experience, and it can be quotes. And often those are more impactful. Data still has a place, but you need to couch it within the values that you know that your audience shares with you. So if you think that people care about logic, if you think that people care about representation, you can tap into those values. And then we get into the some may say note. Now, this is different from the 6th grade essay. And this is when you get to characterize your opposition. So I used to work on issues where we had a lot of people who said, America shouldn't do this. America shouldn't, we worked on transparency issues. America shouldn't make things secret. America should open things up. And what they discovered was when they tested that in focus groups, people are actually less likely to support their arguments. They figured out that it was because when faced with a statement like America should or America shouldn't, people were so patriotic that they couldn't reconcile America doing something wrong with America being a good country. So they created excuses for America to do those things so that there was justification for why they might make something secret. This means that when we're approaching it from our perspective, what we want to do is offer them a choice. So, you know, some believe that the United States should keep things secret. Some believe that America should be transparent. When you allow people to create that choice in their mind, they're much more likely to align with your values. So this is the purpose of the some may say. It's to provide a quick counter argument where you characterize the opposition. So what does that look like in terms of ranked choice voting? A quick counterargument might be, some say that the American public just isn't savvy enough for ranked choice voting, right? So you're actually framing a choice with that kind of sentence, right? You're saying the opposition believes that voters aren't smart enough to follow ranked choice, but you're saying that voters are smart enough, right? You're creating that position where they're going to be more likely to be on your side. Or some may say that the way that things have worked is good enough for us. And this is really your opportunity to set yourself up and say, but I think that we can do better. Or, but I think that the American public is smart enough to be able to rank their candidates. And then finally, you get into the conclusion and why this matters. So if you're writing a 6th grade essay, you might just repeat what you had up at the top. But in this kind of op-ed, the conclusion is why this matters now. So why does this matter in 2020? Why does this matter in a primary season where, let's say you're making an argument that the candidates are not likable. We have a choice to make as the United States. We can decide to follow things as the status quo, or we can stand up for what we believe in. We can set things up so that people vote for the candidates that they care about, or we can set things up so that people vote for the candidate that they think is most likely to win, even if they don't agree with them, right? So creating that incentive to follow through. So those are op-eds. Does that all make sense so far? Any questions? We can pause here.
Again, for new folks, feel free to type in the chat window if you have any questions, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. We'll be getting to your questions throughout the presentation. And one quick note also, folks, feel free to, in the to section of the chat, change that to all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comments. I see some folks trying to interact with each other. We have one, Ashley, that says, how do you submit an op-ed versus a LTE?
Brilliant question. Okay, so if you have to submit an op-ed, reach out to me. I will pass along my email address at the end of the session. Also share with Mohit, and we will work with you to pitch an op-ed. You almost always send the op-ed to what's called an op-ed editor or an opinion editor. And you want to offer it in a very specific way, and we can work with you on that. A letter to the editor is almost always an online form, and you can find it on the website associated with the newspaper that you're reaching out to. Okay. I see we have another QA. Our voting system set up to count ranked choice voting. Does San Francisco have open source voting systems which will count RCV and be copied by other jurisdictions? Yes. Why don't I pass that along to someone who can speak to RCV more specifically?
Yeah, in fact, if Lisa is here on the call, Lisa Arrow, feel free to unmute yourself.
Fantastic.
We will definitely circle back to this in case she's not logged in.
Awesome. I will freely admit I am relatively new. I started at FairVote a month ago after being at Amnesty for 2 years. I was in the office a whole 2 days before social distancing and quarantining began. So I'm still getting to know my new colleagues, mostly through Zoom meetings like this one. So why don't we jump into letters to the editor? Okay. So what's the difference between an op-ed and a letter to the editor? If an op-ed is like speaking on a panel or speaking to a conference of people, a letter to the editor is like responding in a town hall meeting. It's the time where you stand up and your authority comes from being a member of the public, and you make one quick point and then you sit back down. If you've ever been to a conference where they open it up for questions and comments at the end, have you ever noticed that sometimes someone speaks maybe 12 minutes, 15, or, it seems like it takes a really long time. That person is almost never the compelling person that you remember. It's almost always the person who stands up, makes one clear point, everyone in the room looks at each other and says, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way before, and then they sit back down. That's the goal of the letter to the editor. Let's also talk about why letters to the editor are impactful. Newspapers track the topics on the letters that they receive. So even if they never publish your letter to the editor, if you send in a bunch of letters on ranked choice voting to someone, or to an outlet, and they receive those, they might think that it's important for them to editorialize on ranked choice voting. The other thing that letters can do is editors will often decide to publish a bunch of them together. So let's say you get 6 of your friends together and you all write a letter to the editor, which is actually what we're going to do later tonight for those who have time. If you submit all of those letters at once, individually, they're going to be far more likely to publish them as a group, particularly if you all make different points on the same subject. And then lastly, letters to the editor are actually how they decide how they want to editorialize on an issue. So if you're all writing on the importance of ranked choice voting in your community, an editorial staff might think, you know, I didn't really think that this was an issue that people cared about, but we should definitely tap into this community and see what they have to think about this, and create an open dialogue. So it's pretty exciting.
Ashley, can we pause here for 1 second? I believe Lisa is on the call. Let's come back to that one question that Carol had. So let me repeat the question before I bring you in, Lisa. The question is, are voting systems set up to count RCV? As an example, does San Francisco have open source voting systems which will count RCV, and can they be copied by other jurisdictions?
Sure, I'll just, Lisa Aro here, Director of FairVote Washington. That question is one that we could certainly go into the weeds on, but in brief, I can say absolutely yes, and we have plenty of resources to follow up with you on that. If there's time in the Q&A, we could definitely look at it, but better would be to connect with us. I'm sure, Mohit, you're going to be giving some contact information at the end, and I'd be happy to take that up. But the simple answer is yes, the resources are there to do that.
Thank you so much. Back to you, Ashley.
And so let's look at an example of what we could, oh, and also a letter to the editor responds to news, breaking news. So, you know, you wouldn't have someone stand up in an audience and say, well, I think this, and it's just completely in a vacuum, you know, no reference to that previously. What that person does ideally is they stand up and they make a comment in response to the topic that's been discussed. So we're actually going to practice with this later. This is a piece that came out in the Seattle Times yesterday on coronavirus and social distancing in Washington State's election. Perfect, like dream article. This is like, if I had to come up, I was actually talking to Mohit about this. I was like, what if there isn't any news between now and the webinar? And I should have known there would be the perfect article that all of us could respond to with a letter to the editor. So if you live in Washington, and preferably if you live in the Seattle area, you could write a letter tonight, and our hope is that you will consider doing that. So coronavirus and social distancing. This article does not mention ranked choice voting, really, which means that it's all the more important for ranked choice voting to be part of that conversation. You can make arguments that this pandemic would have been a heck of a lot worse on our electoral processes if it had happened just 2 weeks earlier, when we had a dozen people running in the Democratic primary, right? People would have been actively campaigning and also trying to get people out to the polls, and no one would have been able to show up for elections. So how do we set it up, not just so that we have voting at home, but also ranked choice voting? So just keep this in the back of your mind. So let's talk about letters to the editor. Most important thing, timing. As opposed to an op-ed, which you can write usually a couple of days after a news story, a letter to the editor needs to be fast and it needs to be to the point. So you want to submit a letter to the editor no more than 48 hours, ideally after a letter was, or after a news story broke. So going back to this, we're still within that 48-hour time period. The key is to be fast. And then also follow the guidance of the outlet that you're submitting to. So most outlets have on their website an online submission form, maybe an email address that you're supposed to reach out to. Make sure that you include things like your phone number or your address, because what they want to verify is that you're from the community. It wouldn't make sense for someone from Texas, unfortunately, to reach out to the Seattle Times, although I definitely encourage you to practice writing an LTE today. What they want is someone from the community who can represent that public perspective. Next, name who is your change maker in your letter to the editor. So if you're trying to influence someone, name them. I will give 10 points to anyone who can name 2 people on this slide. I'll name 5. I'll give 5 points to whoever can name 1 person. Does anyone recognize? Nice. Carolyn is deep in this. Brilliant. Patty Murray. Okay, so Patty Murray was the easy one. She's a senator from Washington. Tina Podlodowski, who's the chair of the Democratic Party for the state of Washington on the left. Does anyone know the guy on the right? So he is, oh, I didn't even catch it. Oh, Sean Vestal. He is the columnist at the Spokane Review. So let's say he has been talking about elections and you want to influence him and you're responding to a piece that he did, call him out by name. This is also vitally important for elected officials and chairs of party leadership, because they actually clip anything that mentions them by name each day. So I can almost guarantee that Patty Murray has a staffer who's kind of a junior to mid-level staffer, and that person's job is to collect all the clips that mention her by name, particularly in the opinion section of her local newsletter or newspaper, and she likely reads those every morning. So that is the #1 way to affect change on a national level, is to reach out to your local elected official by name. And going to the next. So when we write a letter to the editor, I mentioned earlier that you're responding to news. Mentioning the news item that you're responding to makes it significantly more likely that you're going to get a piece placed. There are usually exceptions to this, like let's say you're drafting a bunch of letters to the editor about ranked choice voting and there's been no mention of elections. If they truly get swarmed by letters, they might end up covering them, but it's almost always best to respond to whatever news was most recent. And I usually do that in the first line of a letter to the editor. It's like, in this piece, they said X. I believe that Y. And then I've heard that the audio of this isn't working, but I'm just going to play it really loudly just in case. I want you to just look at how fast they're talking and decide whether or not they would be effective at convincing you of anything. Just think about the efficacy. No. There we go.
Our critique of military presence, discourse, stability is a crucial contribution to equality.
So has anyone participated in a debate team that uses this particular style of debate? One of the goals of this type of styles of debate is to try, yeah, sorry, Ronald, my audio wasn't working, it was kind of goofy, but they were speaking as quickly as possible. So they were trying to fit in as many arguments as possible in a certain period of time. So if they only have 1:30 to relay their arguments, they know that they'll win the debate by fitting in 12 arguments. Or 13 arguments if the other team is only able to fit in 11, right? So the goal is to try to hit as many points as you can because they won't be able to hit the same number. This isn't effective at actually changing people's minds, right? Sometimes when we only have 150 words and we know that we care about ranked choice voting for a million different reasons, we try to fit in all of those arguments in 150 words, and that never works. What's effective is one clear argument because you only have 150 words to make it. And if you can make it in fewer than 150 words, it's more likely to be read. People don't tend to read longer pieces. So being as specific with one argument as you can is going to be far more effective than trying to fit in as many arguments as possible. And then, does anyone know who this famous quote is by? Just putting this in the, put it in the chat if you know who might have said this. This beacon of politeness and manners. No guesses? It's Mr. T. Mr. T is all about being polite, all about having manners, all about being nice. And that's why Mr. T has such great authority. Whenever I try to edit someone's letter to the editor and it's getting pretty nasty, I tend to quote Mr. T in my editing of said responses. Why do we do this? It's mostly so that you can maintain your authority. I don't know who here is a parent. If you've ever seen a 4-year-old having a tantrum in the middle of a grocery store aisle, often it's about whatever they wish that they could have, but it's also because they know that they don't have control over that situation. The louder that someone is, and the angrier that someone is, and often the ruder someone is, the less power they feel they have, the less control they think they have. So when you're writing a letter to the editor, if you say, I think, this columnist is full of crock and should have gone back to journalism school where he would have learned the basics of civics, you're hopefully not going to get that placed. But if you do get it placed, people are going to think less of you for writing it that way. Letters to the editor should always approach people as being slightly misinformed. Just there is a better way. You might have been mistaken. The exception to this is if someone is doing something particularly cruel or harsh or unconstitutional, or something where there is broad agreement that they're doing the wrong thing, and you're reinforcing the perception that the people that you're trying to influence might have. But even then, it should be from a space of being nice and being kind and being polite. So let's talk about practice, practice, practice. This is, I was just Googling how do you get to Carnegie Hall, practice, 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 and I noticed that Carnegie Hall was temporarily closed, and I found that particularly sad and frustrating. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna set ourselves up to start to work through this, this article. Now I have a link to the form where you're going to be able to fill this out. And before we get to it, here, let me make sure. It should have a link inside the form where you can read the article if you're interested. We're going to pause here, and before we get into practice, we're just going to talk through what an effective letter to the editor would look like for something like this. What arguments do we have for ranked choice voting in a time of social distancing and coronavirus? One is that ranked choice voting allows for people to rank their votes so that they don't have as many wasted votes. So one point that you could make is that we've lost more than 2 million votes this election cycle from people who voted using mail-in ballots or by voting early, and then their candidate dropped out before election day, which means that they lost their vote entirely. Another thing that you could argue for is that right now in this time of social distancing, it's very difficult for people to feel as if they're engaged in the electoral system. And ranked choice voting is a way to make people feel empowered. Another argument that you could make is that ranked choice voting tends to lead to more women and people of color being able to win votes because the system sets itself up so that more people can be represented in office. Another argument that you could make is that ranked choice voting tends to require elected officials to speak to people on either side of the aisle because they know that they have to win that second place vote and they don't have to just speak to their base. You could also talk about mudslinging. So right now we have 2 candidates, or 3 candidates, excuse me, who are running for office in a really contentious, very negative campaign. What we've seen is that ranked choice voting promotes people working together because they want to win that second place vote. Often mudslinging discourages people from running for office, or mudslinging discourages people from showing up to the ballot box rather than encouraging people to show up. And ranked choice voting encourages people to show up. So these are all arguments. Why don't we open it up for people to make their own points about why you care about ranked choice voting, and we can just share it, particularly in this time of coronavirus and social distancing, why you think this matters right now. And just feel free to put it in the chat box. It could be that people are already reading the article. Kathy, I love that. It's less divisive. Yes, ranked choice voting makes early voting effective. How do we address splitting the vote? There might be a third party when people aren't happy with either of the two main party candidates. Yeah. Brilliant. Yes. Less partisanship as candidates work to obtain second and third, et cetera, votes. Kathy, I love that line. People don't have to choose between voting their conscience and choosing who they think can win. That's fantastic. So as we consider writing a letter to the editor, let's talk through structurally how this works. I almost always write a letter to the editor in about 15 minutes. And the goal is not to write the most beautiful thing I've ever written, but it's instead to get something down on paper that I can pass to someone else to edit so that I can send it quickly. So what's a great way of doing this? We've already talked about how letters to the editor are more effective when they come in a bulk. So when lots of people submit them. We have also heard that letters are more effective when they make single points and lots of different people are making different points. One thing that you can do, and we're doing this right now, but you can do this, if you jump off this call and news happens in the next couple of weeks, you can collect people together, just get 6 people, get back on a Zoom call or get onto a Google Hangout or get onto a Skype call, and all of you just talk about that news item and why each of you cares about that issue. And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna spend half an hour just drafting 100 words, maybe. And in those 100 words, make the strongest argument that you can. And then at the end of that half hour, everyone is going to pass that letter to the editor to another person in that party. And that person is going to edit it. So that at the end of an hour, you have 6 letters to the editor ready to go. That's called a letter to the editor writing party. And it is enormously impactful. I love all these arguments that are coming in.
I'll just say, folks, that we can always help facilitate that. I'm going to put our email down in the chat box if anyone needs any support. We're always here to run it by you. We can also facilitate these writing parties for you. We can do a series of webinars. We'd love to hear what would be most useful to you. I'm about to put the email, fairvote.org. You can always reach out to that email if you have a drafted LTE that you want us to look at.
I love every argument that's being made right now. This is fantastic. These are, like, with an introductory sentence and a closing sentence, a perfect letter to the editor. So actually, if you submit, so now what we're going to do is we're going to practice drafting right now. I'm going to answer questions as we go along. So if you have questions, please feel free, but click on the link that Mohit just shared and just start to draft what a letter to the editor could look like for you.
We will take a look at some of these in real time, and Ashley will also get back to you with any edits. So it's great. And in the meantime, Ashley, I'd like to ask you a question.
Yes.
As folks think about the LTE and the op-ed, you've worked through some of the differences between the two. I'd like to ask you, what does it look like when you actually pitch a letter to the editor versus an op-ed?
So a letter to the editor is a very straightforward process. Typically, you pass it along in just the body of an online form. So let's say you're pitching to, I don't know, I'll do our local Baltimore Sun. They have a web page where you submit your name, your phone number, your physical address so that they know that you're from Baltimore, and then a quick letter to the editor. Some places ask for you to email them to them. What I do when they send when I send out an email is I include a quick pitch. So my pitch is no longer than a couple of sentences, but it's saying essentially, my name is Ashley, I'm from this area, this is my phone number, and here's a letter to the editor, and I think this is important because. And I just share why I think that's valuable. But what I also do is I share the letter to the editor. This is actually how I pitch op-eds as well. I share the letter to the editor as a Word document, and I also paste it in the body of the email along with the number of words, the final word count. So I'll say, you know, right, it's time for ranked choice voting in Seattle, and I'll have 123 words, and I'll have my body in the subject heading, or in the body of the email. The other thing is I'm always open to edits. So editors never want to edit your piece to make it worse. They only ever want to make it better. So when they respond and they say, hey, I think that you should really take this last sentence and put it up at the top, there's very rarely a time where I've ever taken issue with an edit. This is all that they do. And their job is not to make you sound dumb or to make you sound like you're not making the right argument. Their job is to just clarify your argument. They're professional writers for you.
Thank you so much. So remember to keep that in mind, folks, as you pitch your local papers or the Seattle Times if you're in the area. The other thing to keep in mind, as Ashley said, is that there are so many reasons to like ranked choice voting, from getting rid of negative campaigning, more choices on the ballot, voter turnout. We're seeing more voter turnout in places that use ranked choice voting. But in the letter to the editor, it's really about making the most effective case and picking one of those arguments maybe to see how it relates to a news spec.
Yeah.
As you write and draft your letter using that form that she shared, please also feel free again to ask any questions you may have. We're also using this as a Q&A with our audience.
Yes.
Ashley, is it effective? Is it necessary when you're pitching an op-ed to have a connection or to know somebody to be pitching it to? Or can people use the general, the letters at op-ed, whatever the general email address is?
It's actually better to pitch your letters to letters at blank or using the form that's online. If you're trying to send an op-ed, that's usually a little bit more of an in-depth process. That person still wants to be found, and you can typically find their email address after a little bit of searching. Mm-hmm. But it's just a bit more of a catered process. So when I'm pitching an op-ed editor, I know that I'm also going to have to lift up my authority. So the reason why my voice is particularly important. I think a good example of that could be someone who, maybe worked on the Warren campaign, right? So someone maybe whose vote felt wasted because they participated in a campaign where their candidate dropped out before election day in their state. That would be an example of an authority that you might not consider traditionally, but is incredibly valuable. It could also be someone who's a strong member of a third party. So let's say that you are part of the leadership of the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or the Alliance Party or the Constitution Party, like any party. You can put yourself out there as an expert because you're speaking with authority on a unique subject that other people don't have the experience in. When I lead a separate training on authority and how we talk about ourselves, and I almost always include a slide that's a guy named Richard Schuerman, and he's on the Food Network, and he's quoted as a shredded cheese authority. Is he actually an expert in shredded cheese? Is he someone who did his dissertation in the value of shredded cheese? No, it's just a guy who happens to run a dairy conglomerate in Wisconsin, right? It's someone who's runs a cheese company. But they look to him to be an expert in this one subject area because he knows he comes at this from a different perspective than other people. The more academic that we are, whether we're PhDs, attorneys, medical doctors, the more often we feel as if we have to be a specialist to be an authority into something. When in fact, all that we need is the experience to make us a unique spokesperson on a specific issue.
Great.
So actually with that,
I'm
going to share my screen soon.
Perfect. And Ashley, Caroline just mentioned that she's not able to open the form. I just wanted to ask folks, is everyone able to open the link? Is that just a concern specific to Caroline? I can share the link yet again, but you should be able to click on it. It leads you to a Google form. You have it open, it's working. Great. Caroline, I can send it to you separately and we can see, you can also feel free to email me, Caroline, and we can workshop it that way. Oh, great. You put it in your browser. Perfect. All right. Looks like it's working for folks. Great.
Okay. So I'm going to share my screen again. We're just going to take a look at the first one. Oh, and before I do this, can I get a brief moment of circle of trust? So all of us are in this together. All of us are writing letters to the editor, some of us for the first time. There is no ego in this. All of us are here for ranked choice voting. If we go through people's content, it's all from the spirit of us making our content collectively better. This is an inherently vulnerable experience of writing something and then immediately having people take a look at it. But I'm really excited by what I've seen so far. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. So practice, practice, practice. In light of calls for election reform during the pandemic, there has been talk about online voter registration and mail-in ballots, and I wanted to add another reform to the conversation, ranked choice voting. It is the act of ranking your candidates instead of traditionally just choosing your one and only candidate. It is a crucial reform as it will allow voters more choice and eliminate expensive runoff elections. If their first choice doesn't win, their second or third choice have a shot. Oh, this is awesome. Okay, brilliant writing already. What do people like about this? So I'm just gonna open up the chat again so that I can see it.
Clear argument is what Andrew's saying. Great, it's to the point, Adam.
It is such a clear argument. It does that perfectly, right? It's the one person who stands up in the crowd and they say, you know, why don't we just add ranked choice? This is what ranked choice is. It's an obvious solution for us. I think it's fantastic. If we were to make this even stronger, how might we add to it? Sorry, I'm trying to get to the chat. I seem to have lost the chat box. Any additions that people would have?
We have two suggestions. One saying a specific call to action, maybe mention the article that it is in response to. So we see a news peg in the beginning with a pandemic, but is there a specific article? Great, keep them coming.
Quoting the article, brilliant. I think something else that I would love to see is why this personal connection to ranked choice voting. Mm-hmm. So if you are a civics teacher and are trying to explain something, or if you are personally frustrated with both of the candidates, the presumed candidates in the national general election, what brings you to the table? This is brilliant. Okay, so I'm going to pull up another one. I am so excited. That was so good.
Well
guys
done.
This
Thank
is
you for
awesome.
sharing this.
Dang. This is awesome. Okay, so I'm going to do another one. Okay. Thanks for your patience as I update these slides. As you can guess, I'm just updating these as we go. Okay. There we go. So I'm going to read the next one. I'm so grateful to live in a jurisdiction where it's possible to vote by mail, especially in these times of where going to the polls can put one's life on the line. Title of that article, right on. Seattle Times, April 5th, 2020. However, many of us mailed our ballots before some of the candidates dropped out. So by Washington's election day, the candidate we voted for wasn't running anymore. If we had ranked choice voting, I wouldn't have to guess who would still be in. I could simply rank my choices and know that the system would then allocate my vote to the appropriate candidate. If my first choice candidate dropped out or simply didn't get enough votes to have viability, my ballot would go to the next candidate on the list. My vote would still count. Please consider using ranked choice ballots for Washington's next election.
Brilliant.
touchdown. This is awesome. Okay, so what do people like about this? And again, whenever I've added these, I've lost my chat box, but.
Again, an extremely clear argument. I'll just get us started.
Yeah.
What do other folks like about this?
I like how polite it is. Like, isn't it great of you know, like this, it starts from a place of gratitude, which is so rare when you're trying to bring up a frustration, right? It would be so easy to say, yeah, we've got mail-in ballots, but come on. Ranked choice voting means that, you know, we wouldn't lose our votes along the way. But this really gets to the importance of building on where you feel as if you've seen successes in your community. Yes, very personal connection. I really love that it connects to the importance of voting at home right now. Yes, if only we'd done that way. I think that's a wonderful line. If only we could have changed this system.
What do folks think about the ask? Is there a clear ask in there?
I think this is great. Yeah, it strengthens the argument of the original article. Takes what you liked about the article. Yes. Should they add a person by name like Kim the SOS? Yes, I think adding a person's name would be really smart. So who is your change maker in the scenario? How do we get ranked choice voting inside Seattle? Who is the person that we need to target with this to make this move forward? In some states, it's the head of the leadership, the party leadership. In some states, it's the Secretary of State. It's, you know, and if you're looking for something more on a national argument, so let's say you're fighting for the Fair Representation Act, it could be members of Congress or senators. Yeah, I love the place of gratitude. Okay, I'm gonna do another one. Guys, these are so good. Oh my goodness.
I will quickly jump in to just say that someone noted that the ask was very clear. I definitely agree. Please consider using ranked choice voting in Washington's next election. I'll also say here at FairVote Washington, we're always available to help anybody who wants to put in a clear ask. If you want to get in touch and ask, you know, what would be the best thing to pitch, we're available to assist you. For example, we have a local options bill that we're going to be pushing in the next legislative session. So if you come back to writing your LTE during that time, that's another thing to be talking about. There's a very clear pitch around wasted votes right now.
Okay. So here's another one. Yesterday's article on Washington's vote-by-mail system is particularly timely, but fails to mention one of the pitfalls. I submitted my ballot well before the deadline because I was going to be out of town on the deadline. As a result, my ballot was ultimately wasted because my chosen candidate dropped out the weekend before the deadline. A solution to this problem is ranked choice voting, by which I could have voted my preferences in order. Ultimately, I would have had input because one of my choices would have still been in the race. This is fantastic. Brilliant. What do we like about it? Yes, Andrew tells a story. Oh, the number of times where the personal experience wins the day. You could put a million pieces of data out here and it wouldn't necessarily be compelling, right? And it doesn't come from a place of argument of I'm right and you're wrong. It is just my personal story. This is what happened with me. Oh, wonderful. I'll also share something on empathy. A number of social psychologists have discovered that when you tell one person's story, it creates the bond of empathy. And when you tell the same story about two people, it actually deteriorates your level of empathy by 50%. So rather than caring twice as much because it's happened to two people, you care half as much because you can't relate as much to two people compared to one. We are inherently very tribal creatures. And so the more that you can make a personal experience to one person, the more that you can share your own personal experience, strength, and hope, the more likely someone is going to be convinced of it. Yes. Oh, Caroline, definitely brilliant. Caroline notes, I know that the Texas state runoff was pushed to July 14th. That would be the ideal time for me to send a letter to the editor. So take note if you have a runoff election coming up. Caroline, can I see you and raise you a press story by any chance? If you are getting, let's say, a dozen people, doesn't have to be that many, a dozen people to participate in a letter to the editor party on Zoom one night, I think I could pitch that to your local broadcast news station as an example of how people are engaging in advocacy, even at home. So if you're still under quarantine and you still have to participate in this online, which hopefully is no longer the case, but if it is, what local news stories are, local news broadcast news stations are constantly looking for are stories where they have interesting visuals of what it means for a lot of people to come together to work towards something. And they don't tend to have these kinds of opportunities as much. So I've pitched that and I've gotten that successfully placed before. If you're in person, all the better. Serve pizza, talk through why you care about this issue, invite a local broadcast journalist to come with you. People love covering this. Similarly, if you're, this is more broad advocacy, if you're ever hosting a rally or a protest, what ends up being the most successful story is almost never the protest itself. It's inviting the broadcast, local broadcast to come with you as you organize and you start to plan around it, as you make your protest signs. They love that content.
Ashley, there's a couple of questions for you.
Yeah.
So one is, can the examples be sent over email to everyone for future reference?
As long as you all don't mind, I don't mind. We can make them anonymous and thus no one will know who wrote them. And so I think that sounds great. Let's share them. The only thing that I would caution is don't copy and paste. So newspapers know the moment that you copy and paste a letter to the editor because they'll get it from multiple sources. So when they do that, it's actually training them not to pay attention to what you write. What they want are unique arguments. What they want are authentic. They can all sound similar, but they shouldn't sound exactly the same. Okay, I want to do another one. Oh, this is the best. Gosh, okay. We have 7. This is great. Okay.
While Ashley's doing that, I will just add, I know we've had a lot of great questions about ranked choice voting itself. And I will say that there are a host of webinars that we're putting on, not just an LTE writing workshop. We have the RCV 101 webinars that you can sign up for on our website. And that'll walk through the basics of ranked choice voting, why it's something that's an important issue, what it is. So be sure to sign on, and that's a space for you to ask all questions related to ranked choice voting. For folks who've already attended one of the RCV 101 webinars, you can come to our advocacy workshop, which is put on by our field director, Cassie Allen. And in that particular webinar, you learn how to be an effective practitioner of RCV, or at least how to communicate effectively about RCV. So there's a host of different events that we're putting on that you should be tuned into.
Okay, so here's another one. The current pandemic has pushed us to distance socially, but it has also brought us together in spirit. There is a way we can also change our voting system to start bringing us together as well. Ranked choice voting. Because ranked choice voting allows people to choose their second and third choices, we will more often end up with a less polarizing candidate, one that can reach across the aisle and represent everyone in some way, making it so the most favorable candidate wins the election. Guys, these are really good. I'd love for people to share what they like about this one. Yeah, isn't that a great opening? I think it's fantastic. This strikes me as a great hook for an op-ed, right? So this gives you a lot of room to provide evidence for different arguments. So let's say I were drafting an op-ed. So we're looking at 600 to 700 words. The current pandemic has pushed us to distance socially, but it's brought us together in spirit. Ranked choice voting is a way to do that. I can already imagine what my supporting paragraphs would look like. So one supporting paragraph might be how we've reached this point where we have really polarizing candidates and what plurality wins elections look like. Another paragraph would be examples of where ranked choice voting starts to pull in people who wouldn't normally be able to win. And then, you know, you could do your some may say that the status quo has been enough, but, you know, bring it right back to how you feel in a pandemic of this is the time where we should all be fighting together and work past the status quo. I love this. What would we add to this? Anything that people would want to add or update? So I would definitely call out a change maker in this because the values are so on the mark. Like you really want that change maker to get how they need to be on the right side of this issue, right? With this ads, the hook is personal and it provides value, but it also provides urgency, right? And that call to action can be really helpful. Any other thoughts on this one? It's really great. Okay, I'm gonna do one last one and then we can stop and share questions. I have to say, this has just been such an absolute pleasure. Let's see. Sorry, this just took me a quick second. I'm going to share my screen one more time. Okay. In regards to Joseph O'Sullivan's April 5th article about states adopting vote by mail, I wholeheartedly agree that vote by mail should be used nationwide. It is not only easy, but also a cost-effective way to let people participate in democracy. In addition, states should add ranked choice voting as it would allow voters to rank their preferences when choosing between multiple candidates, rather than simply picking someone because they think that candidate can win. It's an easy way to allow voters to truly feel more enfranchised by the voting process. Ooh, I like this one. Okay. What do we like about this one in particular?
Very clear reference to an article.
Yes. So let's also get into what motivates reporters. This isn't really a reporter relations training or media relations training, but let's talk about what it's like to be a reporter these days. There's an assumption in a lot of our minds that reporters are either of two people. And I don't know if people here are comic book people, but people think of J. Jonah Jameson from Spider-Man, right? It's like, get me that headline. Or they imagine April O'Neil from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as the person who's gonna fight no matter what to get to the bottom of the story. Neither of these stereotypes tend to be true. Reporters are very tired people. They're exhausted. They're often filing up to 3 or 4 stories a day, depending on what kind of outlet they write for. They simply don't have enough time to write in-depth stories, and there isn't the funding to write those in-depth stories either. What they care about are getting people to read their pieces, but they also want to affect change. No one got into journalism because they thought that they would make a huge amount of money. What they want is for their articles to matter. And so when you use their name and and share their work as valuable, that means a lot to them. And that's valuable for you down the line, particularly if you want to engage that reporter on a different subject. So let's say Joseph O'Sullivan, I don't actually know if he's the campaigns reporter in Seattle, but let's say that he is. Joseph O'Sullivan is going to have to write an article at least 3 or 4 times a week on the election cycle between now and November, specifically on Seattle. He will run out of things to talk about more than once, and he's going to be looking for stories. If he knows that you've been following his content, he's going to be far more likely to cover your work down the line. I love that. What else would people add to this? I also like that it mentions cost effectiveness. We haven't really gotten into this argument too much, but cost efficacy is one of the issues that people care about who might not care about some of the other values that people have talked about. So maybe you don't think that the current system is broken. Like maybe you like your party, you always vote for whoever's there. You know, you show up for runoff elections. You don't mind missing a couple of hours of work. You know, voting by mail isn't a huge deal to you, but you really think that people should stop wasting money. This is a great argument for that person. Kathy, great point. So instead of states should, you can put in and make it about your state and put in a tie to something local. So how does this connect to your community? One of the best openings to an op-ed I've ever seen was here in Texas, everything is big. We have big hearts. We have big hearts to match the size of our state, but not when it comes to this elected official who said this thing on social media about a minority community. It was a really important op-ed, and it was valuable because it created the personal connection immediately. Yes, Caroline, RCV saves millions, saves you from waking up for that runoff election. But runoff elections particularly important right now, right? We don't want to send people to the polls twice, much less twice. It's really valuable. Okay, so we have just a couple of minutes left, and what I'd love to do is to open this up in case we have additional questions about letters to the editor or op-eds, or if people have questions about how we might want to frame the work that we're doing in the current news cycle. I'd also like to share, I'm really excited that folks are interested in potentially pitching the op-eds that they've drafted. So what we're gonna do is start to provide edits and respond with links to where they can submit this letter to the editor.
Any other questions, folks? It can be about effective messaging tips. It can be about how to write an LTE or an op-ed. Oh, we see a few comments come in.
Great. Okay. Do you have a method for seeking out these types of articles? Do I search for specific terms in some kind of search engine? Do you sift through some of your favorite papers? That is a great question. I started off my career by doing clips. I did clips on 5 different issue areas every morning. I set up Google News alerts. I also set up something called a Feedly. So back then it was Google something, but it was a Google Reader. So I used to look through my Google Reader every day, and I had my favorite columnists. I had my favorite front pages of different local outlets across the country. The Seattle, or the Stranger, Seattle's weekly, alt weekly, was always on my list. And I would read their top headlines. But that was when I was covering a huge number of issues. Now what I do is I just have a Google alert that goes up for something like ranked choice voting or for FairVote. Or if I'm interested in something broader, I'll just have a Feedly of all of the different election coverage of the day.
I just want to bring up one question that just surfaced, and I want to point this one to Lisa Arrow, actually. So Lisa's still on the call. So Kathy says, now that we're down to only 2 candidates, it feels a little less pressing than it did earlier in the primary season, but we still need it for next time. Lisa, can you help point folks to what could be something pressing to write about in this time?
Oh gosh, well, certainly the wasted votes is continuing to resonate. We're seeing, as Ashley said, we're up to, I think, 2 million votes in that FairVote vote tracker right here in Washington. 500,000, just under 500,000, well, actually just under 400,000 people wasted their votes on candidates who were no longer in the race by the time the ballots were counted. Mohit, anything else come to mind right away for you? Topics. Just newsworthy topics. I think we've touched on so many in this call. I'm trying to think if there's anything I have to add.
Absolutely. And I mean, coming back to the idea of the coronavirus pandemic and how people are back at home right now, the importance of vote by mail and linking that to ranked choice voting, and how we have this great system in place here in Washington State, but voters should not feel like they waste their vote. So connect the two by all means. It's all about under the ambit of improved democracy for folks.
Yep.
And this is a bit more for our friends and colleagues that joined from FairVote nationally, but there are plenty of down ballot races that are still very contentious right now, where there are multiple candidates that are still running. There are a number of states where maybe it isn't about the presidential election, but it's about who's running for mayor or city council. And those local elections end up having a huge impact. And those are actually a perfect opportunity for you to engage the local press, because they're looking for new and interesting ways to cover those races.
All right, we're just getting ready to wrap up here, folks. Any final questions for Ashley? It's after 10 p.m. where Ashley is right now on the East Coast. So we're very grateful for her time.
Of course.
And I just want to point out again, I'll put our email here that's Ashley's email, and this is our email at FairVote Washington. So please feel free to get in touch with us at any point. I will also mention that we have a RCV 101 webinar tomorrow at 1 p.m. We typically try to do 2 a week. We're scheduling 2 a week now. They should show up on our calendar on our website in the next day or two. But be sure to catch those, and that's where you'll learn a lot more about ranked choice voting and what it is as a piece of reform. Any final thoughts from you, Ashley, as we wrap up?
I just wanted to share how thrilled I am at how empowered people have been to share their work with this. As someone who's worked in media for the last decade, often I see some hesitation to engage the news cycle, or a feeling like somehow the news is this nebulous thing that's really hard to tap into. And I can tell how extraordinary the supporters are in this space. You really are authorities. I do see one question: are there FairVote chapters in other states? Yes, and how? So Gregory, feel free to reach out to me over email, and I'll connect you to our outreach director at FairVote, and who can connect you to local advocates in your community. Mohit, I'll let you respond to Ronald on receiving a copy of this session.
Yes, we have
I'm thrilled that it's been recorded.
Yes, absolutely. It's being recorded, and our technology director, Chris Mason, is going to be working to get this up online for folks, and we'll send a copy out to all of you. It may take a couple of days, but we will definitely get it to you.
Mohit, Lisa here. May I just
Lisa.
pass along my thanks to everybody who joined us tonight. We have been so excited about this. I cannot imagine that it could possibly have gone any better. And Ashley, it's just been a stupendously empowering presentation you've given us. I can tell we're going to be having letter to the editor parties, especially during our legislative session coming up. But whenever we have other newsworthy moments, it's a fantastic idea. We're going to do it. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you to all of you for being such an engaging audience. We really appreciated the questions. These entries have been fantastic. You guys are ready to rock and roll. So please be sure to organize writing parties. We're going to wrap up just about now. And a big thank you again to Ashley. Thank you for hosting this and coming out to tell us about this. And folks, please get in touch if you have any other questions. You have our emails. Thank you so much. Until next time. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.
Stay safe and well.